Hi everybody, this is Kyle and this is Zawiya Karkaria channel. Today we have a special guest, Professor Yousuf Casewit, and we're going to talk about an important question. It's a very simple question, but not many people know about, which is what is Sufism? Okay. Hi Yousuf, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid, for having me.
Okay. So,
Pleasure.
okay, so would you introduce yourself to us first before we ask you or bombard you with questions?
Well, my name is Yousuf Casewit. I'm an academic and a practitioner of and student of Sufism, and I'm happy to discuss the topic of what is Sufism. It's a very broad and challenging question, but I use oral traditions that I've been engaged in and that I've benefited from, and the teachings of our Sheikh, and academic studies that I've written and that I've read, and my own ongoing research to try to offer a definition of what is Sufism. It's a very challenging question, it's a broad one. Ascribing a start date to Sufism, historicizing the movement as broad as Tasawwuf. And one of the best things one can do is really turn to the Hadith of Gabriel, what's called Hadith Jibril, or you can quote some beautiful poetry and convey, you might say, something of the spirit. Yeah. But the Hadith of Gabriel is a summation of the entire Islamic teaching, and it encapsulates, you could say, like the meta-historical reality of Islam. It's a hadith that's been retold and transmitted and memorized, and it actually occurred in the last 2 months of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, or like about 80 days before he died, according to some reports. And so it's close to the last period of his own earthly life, and it summarizes practice, thought, and spirituality, or you could say the legal dimension of fiqh, or outward sort of jurisprudence, aqidah, theology and belief, creed, and tahqiq, verification, authentication, realization of the Islamic tradition. So you could say you have correct activity, correct understanding, and then realization that's brought together in the Hadith of Gabriel. So when you say what's Sufism, it's one of those three aspects, and that's in this respect. It's you could say the spiritual dimension of the Islamic tradition. And the Hadith begins with Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu, a very prominent and important companion, who's the narrator of this Hadith. And Umar says, one day when we were with God's Messenger, والسلام, a man with very white clothing and very black hair came upon us, or he came up to us, and no mark of travel was visible upon him. And so you have here, Medina is where this encounter occurs in Arabia. It's a village by our standards, and it's strange for the companions to see that there's no sign of travel upon this man. And he's a stranger, he has black hair, he doesn't look like he was traveling, but nobody knew him. Because Umar says, but none of us recognized him. And then he displays signs of intimacy with the Prophet, and he says, sitting down before the Prophet, and he sits knee to knee, leaning his knees against his, and placing his hands on his thighs. Placing knees against the Prophet's knees and palms upon his thighs is a sign of respect, intimacy, and this probably shocked the companions. And because they don't know who he is, and they've been with him for so long. And he comes, and he's clearly someone that he's not known, and he says, tell me, Muhammad, about submission. So he doesn't even use the Prophet's title, أخبرني يا محمد عن الإسلام, or Islam, submission, surrender. Salam means wholesomeness, peace, sort of integrity. And someone who surrenders oneself to God has that wholesomeness or surrender or peace or integrity that flows through them, through that surrendering or alignment with the reality of God's oneness. And so when this man says, "Oh Muhammad, tell me about submission," he said, "Akhbirni an Islam, give me a khabar, give me a report about it. Uh, give me news of it, give me a khabar, like a transmitted report." And he replies, submission means that you should bear witness that there is no God but God, that Muhammad is God's messenger, and that you should perform the ritual prayer and pay the alms tax, fast during Ramadan, and make the pilgrimage to the house if you're able to go there. And here he lists the 5 pillars of the faith. Alayhi salatu wassalam. Shahada is an act that's with the tongue, and the testimonial of faith, right? The testimony of faith. So he begins with that to affirm God's oneness and the prophecy and messengerhood of Muhammad ﷺ, and then to follow that up with by punctuating your life 5 times a day with a prayer, thereby sanctifying every period of the day, and then purifying your wealth with this alms tax we call zakat, and then fasting at least once 1 month per year, that's the fast of Ramadan, and then performing the pilgrimage or the Hajj. And then what's strange about this hadith or unusual is that this man, whom nobody knows, affirms what the Prophet has said. And he says, "You have spoken the truth." And then the companions say, Umar says, "We were surprised at his questioning him and then declaring that he had spoken the truth." Because first of all, the man comes in, they assume he's ignorant. I mean, from the report, he's just a man who comes to ask a question, and he displays intimacy with the Prophet, and but now he's affirming him, and so here's someone who wasn't really going to teach them, at least in the eyes of those who were present, and suddenly he becomes not only the teachers of the companions, but he's affirming the Prophet himself, and so they were dumbstruck. The companions were like, "Who is this man coming in and telling us about this?" And what you have here is the companions now have been with the Prophet ﷺ, many of them through Medina. Sayyidina Umar embraced Islam in Mecca. So you have years in Mecca and almost 13 years now in Medina, and practice has been perfected. They've undergone, you could say, tarbiyah, spiritual training, nurturing at the hands of the Prophet ﷺ. And this now is like it's a theoretical, overarching conception of what they've been doing this whole time. And so what's Islam? And then he says, now tell me about faith. What is Iman? And faith also translates as a state of certitude, al-amn, right? It's a condition of certainty, unshakable certainty. It's more than just faith, because faith in English has a sense of abstract belief. But when you say Iman, there's a sense of trust and concrete certitude that comes with it. So he says, "Akhbirni anil iman," and the Prophet, he doesn't tell you what Iman is in this hadith. He rather lists the pillars of Iman. In another hadith, he tells you what Iman is. Here he says faith means that you should have faith in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, the last day, and that you should have faith in the measuring out, al-qadar. It's both its good and its evil. In a different hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says faith is a light in the heart. It increases and decreases with beautiful deeds. And here he affirms the you could say the pillars of the faith, because he's also teaching the companions and us by extension what it means to be a mu'min, not just to be a practitioner, a Muslim, someone who submits with the outer limbs, but someone who has Iman and follows through with beliefs or pillars of the heart. Having now, the hadith continues, remarking that he had spoken the truth. He then said, now this unknown visitor, who's clearly has everyone's attention, who's affirming the truth of the Prophet, he says, now tell me about doing what is beautiful, or tell me about spiritual excellence or virtue, al-ihsan. And here the Prophet says, doing what is beautiful, ihsan, or It's a transitive form of an intransitive verb that doesn't take an object. Ihsan. Hasuna is to be beautiful, and ihsan is to make something beautiful. And so, ihsan here, doing the beautiful, or being virtuous, uh, is, he says, that you should worship God as if you see Him, for even if you do not see Him, He sees you. And this is what the Shaykh calls kaful ihsan, the kaf of divine imminence, or the kaf of spiritual excellence, whereby the emphasis here is on the direct witnessing, as if you see Him, because God in and of Himself is unqualified and cannot be contained or qualified by even our non-qualification of His non-qualification. He's utterly transcendent and absolute and beyond all grasp. At the same time, there's a descent, you could say. The ayah has Allah nur samawati wal ard, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, but that unqualified light of Allah has a mathal, has a representation. Mathal nurih is like a niche in which there's a lamp, in which there is a glass, and so it's contained in a glass. And here you have a similar thing where you worship God as if you see Him. You're not seeing God as such, you're seeing the highest representation of Allah Ta'ala, which is God's light. And so what you have here is in this hadith, and it goes on to talk about the branches of the end times and so on, and the signs of the end. But you have here how to behave with your body, Islam, what your heart should do in alignment with the outward bodily comportment, Iman, and then finally the highest level, which is Ihsan, the act of worshipping God at that level. It's like driving on the highway as if you're being watched by state police. You're very conscious of every movement you're doing. Your movement changes, right? Versus when you're just driving casually. That's that level of ihsan where drive as if you're like the cop is seeing you, and even if even if you don't see him, he sees you, right?
Right, correct.
Like we rarely drive that well, but to worship God at that level, that's ihsan, where there's a tangible concreteness that's it impacts how you behave, how you comport yourself.
What
So that's it. I mean that. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I mean, I want to add that what intrigues me about this hadith while listening to you, that it's the question is what, and the answer is how. Yeah, it was like a watered down information. What is Islam? The Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't say is submission to God. He said, "This is how you are, how you do it." What's Iman? He didn't say
Mm-hmm.
at this, in this scenario. Yeah, this light being, casted into the heart. It is that so and so and so believe in God, as if he's talking to everybody
Yeah.
at every level. And what's ihsan? He didn't say Allah nur samawati, or he didn't say Allah is the light of heaven and earth. He say, just worship
Mm.
him as if you see him. So it was kind of speaking to all
Yeah.
levels of understanding and water down to the lowest, most,
Well,
the
you have
simple
this.
mind.
So that's right. Well, the interaction between the two, in and of itself, is the great teaching, because when the man leaves and they say they don't, they wait for a while, and then he asks, "Do you know who that was?" And Sayyidina Umar says, "God and His Messenger know." And the Prophet says, "It was Gabriel. He came to teach you your religion." And so you have here an implied hierarchy, like a mountain structure, from the Muslim to the mu'min to the muhsin, from the submitter to the believer to the spiritual, sort of virtuous human being. And this sort of, so you have the horizontal dimension of Islam or practice, you have the vertical dimension of Iman or faith, and then you have Ihsan, which gives it depth. So you have this almost like a triangulated, three-dimensional formation that
Hmm.
comes out of that interaction. And so the questions themselves and posed by Jibreel alayhi salam uh, are uh, are the teaching. They are part of the teaching, and then how the Prophet ﷺ fleshes out those questions by concretely giving sort of the articles of faith and the foundational practices of the religious sort of rituals, and then a tangible. It's also أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. It's also a very tangible, concrete goal. You see, had the Prophet ﷺ given an abstract, broad, overarching definition of what Islam is, and then an abstract one of what Iman is, then there would be also an abstract one of what Ihsan is. But there's concreteness. You see, this, it's part of the beautiful mystery of this teaching. There's a concreteness in the practice that's given, and it's framed by the question, what is submission? And by the fact that it comes first, its precedence in the hadith, in the report, and then there's a concreteness in the layers or the articles of faith laid out by the Prophet ﷺ. And then also, and this is what people often miss out, a concreteness in the meaning of ihsan and its practice, which is to the visualization of the nur, basically. And تعبد الله كأنك تراه.
What is nur?
So
Nur is some people, this ask, talk about nur. Is it the light? Is it or is it something that we can talk about in different, episode?
Well, it's something one can reserve for a different episode, but in summary, if faith is defined as a light in the heart that increases and decreases with good deeds, right? That's faith. Then at the level of ihsan or virtue, spiritual excellence, it's when that light in the heart floods upon the limbs. And so the light in the heart then subsumes or encompasses your speech, your hearing, your tongue, your hands, your feet, your stomach, your part, right? Your entirety becomes faith. Your entirety becomes that nur. And so a sign of that occurring is when the light of the heart unites with the light of the eye.
Right.
And the definition of a wali, of a friend of God, is precisely that. You keep approaching God with extra deeds, with extra devotions, supererogatory devotions, until God loves the servant. And when he does, then he becomes the hearing with which God hears, right? I become with the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, and so on. The servant doesn't become God, but the opposite occurs, whereby God's the hearing of the servant becomes God's hearing. There's a difference there, but the seeing becomes his seeing, and that's the same concept of worshiping God as if you see Him,
Exactly.
where you're not seeing through your own seeing anymore, and hence the emphasis in Sufism on light, on the trying to aspire to a state where you see light. That's why the Sheikh says, "Man lam yushahid," the one who doesn't directly witness the light, is not my disciple, and I'm not his sheikh, because there's nothing for me to teach him. There's nothing for me to transmit to him or her. There's nothing in the disciple for me to recognize. That's our relationship. And once you fall short of it, you have to dig yourself out of that space, that darkness, and climb back out of it and come meet him at that maqam.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are approaching the last minute, so thank you so much, Professor Yousuf Casewit, and we'll have another, inshallah, have another episode with you. So you put it down very nicely. Even I understood it. That the first layer is what to do, and the second one, second component is what to believe in, and the third one is the purpose. How to verify all that by seeing God. So to Islam, to believe in certain faith, and to worship God as if you see Him. And thank you so much. We'll hopefully we'll have you in another episode if you have the time.
Inshallah ta'ala. Allahumma salli ala Habib Mustafa. Thank you for having me.
Sayyidina Muhammad. Okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.